happy sunny Monday. The weather behaved for our event today, which is really wonderful. Welcome to the launch of Home Reconstructed, the remarkable installation by Kabita, who you will be hearing from shortly. This is also the soft launch of the Chronicle of Asylum, Refugees, and Displacement, cleverly acronymized as CARD. And you can take a look at the Chronicle here, CARD, which does feature Kabita's work as we move out to the piece of art, and we'll also have objects here for you to look at. So my name is Carrie Preston. I'm the director of Kilachand Honors College, as well as a professor in the English department and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Before we start, I want to offer a land acknowledgement, also acknowledging that critiques of these statements that they have become formulaic performances. But I think this is really important, especially for an event like this, an artistic installation that interrogates ideas of home and the spaces we share. I acknowledge that Boston University operates on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Massachusetts people. The anglicized version of their name was taken for the state we now call, of course, Massachusetts, and the words Algonquin, meaning Blue Hills, refers to the chain of hills that make up what we now call the Blue Hills Reservation, to the south of Boston. I acknowledge the painful history of settler colonialism, genocide, and forced removal from this territory, and I honor the many indigenous peoples still connected to this land. I recognize the great need to meaningfully engage with the Massachusetts people beyond land acknowledgements like this one. I pay my respects to the original people of this land and offer gratitude to the sustaining land itself. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Ty Furman, who is the founding managing director of the BU Arts Initiative. Ty Furman is a nationally recognized creator and manager of unique arts programs in higher education, and for the past little over a decade, the Arts Initiative has been developing and supporting university-wide programs to advance the role of the arts at BU through building community, supporting interdisciplinary arts teaching, learning, and research, and highlighting diverse artists and modes of artistry. Ty has been an incredible collaborator for me, for Kilachand, and is one of the co-sponsors of this event. So please welcome him.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Kabita. I just have mostly a couple of other thank yous to offer. One in particular to Kabita for hanging in there. We had at one point hoped that we would install this while she was still a student here, but we are thrilled that it's up now. I also want to in particular thank BU Facilities and Mike Mercurio and John Mackey and all the gentlemen in the carpentry shop who took the time to consult with Kabita on the design, the structure, the materials, and were really, really diligent about doing what the artist wanted for this project. So we are really grateful, in particular, for a facilities office that supports student public art, and we hope to continue that. We also are hoping to install at least 2, maybe 3 other student-generated public art projects on campus this spring. Details are yet to sort of work themselves out in terms of installation dates, so keep an eye on the social media for the BU Arts Initiative, and we'll announce those as they come. It will be 2 muralish and 1 other kind of installation mural mix-up thing. And just in terms of Carrie's land acknowledgement, a quick shout out. We do have an artist in residence right now, Dakota Mace, who is a Dene, which is the original, their name for what we used to call Navajo Nation. She's a Dene photographer, weaver, and all-around extraordinary artist. And we do have one more public event with her tomorrow evening at 7:30. It's the Tuesday night MFA lecture series in the School of Visual Arts. And this is almost the end of our year of programming for Indigenous Voices in the Americas. So we've spent an entire year highlighting artists, Indigenous artists from North and South America throughout about 15 different academic programs at the university. University. So we're thrilled to have supported that. And in particular, I like the notion of thinking about what is home for us and for those resilient folks who are still here, still living on this land, still surviving, thriving, creating art, and building community. So once again, I'm thrilled to have been part of this project, and am I? Okay, Carrie's coming back up. Thank you all.
So Ty wasn't just part of this project. He was absolutely crucial at every phase. It turns out it's really tough to get public art approved on campus in the city of Boston and beyond. But we're learning, we're doing more and more of this. And I was reflecting on the importance of public art on my walk over when I saw a tour group in the installation looking at it and just thinking, what are these prospective students and parents thinking about BU, in part because here is Kabita's installation. This is such a BU project. As Ty was mentioning, BU Carpentry built this with such sensitivity and attention to Kabita's artistry. It was really moving to be part of this collaboration and to learn from it. So as Ty suggested, this launch is the culmination of really years of work, rework, vision, and revision, and a ton of persistence. So before I introduce Kabita Das, who is really the hero of these many years, I want to share a little bit about the history of this project from my admiring perspective. So for this history, take yourselves back to March 2020 for a moment. Remember where you were, what you were doing, what were you looking forward to? Those of you who were here with me at BU took off for spring break, and most of us never imagined that we would not be coming back for campus or just coming back to grab a few things from our dorm rooms for months and sometimes longer. Kabita had been preparing for an installation of her College of Fine Arts thesis project and Kilachand Keystone project, a provocative installation that asked us to experience and consider the complexity of our shared use of space. In the original design, as I remember, when one participant wanted to look more closely at an object hanging on a string in the installation, they might find that they were pulling the object hung on the other end of the string away from someone else. Our tug of war, our literal interconnectedness in space. Kabita was deep in her planning for this project that would bring people closer in space. But the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, had other plans for her and for us. Not only was that installation impossible, but Kabita was isolating at home with her family and everything that spring, including the Keystone Symposium presentation, went virtual. What is amazing to me is that instead of presenting her original project with a heavy dose of disappointment, which, by the way, would have been totally fine, it is what many of us did in that time. Kabita worked to translate the goals of her design into a virtual space and created this really remarkable experience of pulling on, downloading strings of words and messages with the sort of trust it takes to download something from an internet source. She made us ask, what is public and what is home in digital space? How are ideas of home shifting as families were unexpectedly thrust at home together? How does home incorporate experiences of migration and intercultural connection? You need to go to her virtual installation and explore more. We were stunned by the film, this virtual installation, and her presentation of her experience at the Keystone Symposium. Kabita's home piece left a lasting impression on many of us working at BU's initiative on forced displacement. We were working to create a new interdisciplinary journal with the goal of helping researchers, artists, and practitioners concerned with forced displacement communicate with each other. We decided that our first issue of what would be called HARD, the Chronicle of Asylum, Refugees, and Displacement, would feature the work of emerging artists and scholars on the topic of home. We were reflecting that while many of us were lucky enough to be staying home to mitigate the transmission of COVID-19 and flatten the curve, remember when that's what everyone was saying? It's changed so much. At that time, the pandemic was causing even more suffering to those who had been forcibly displaced from their homes by violence and persecution, environmental disaster, mass incarceration, or economic circumstances. A year later then, our access to the COVID-19 vaccine also depended so much on where we were located, what we called home, even if that location wasn't so much what we thought of as home. So in our inaugural issue of Hard launching today, we selected the topic of home in hopes of exploring that shifting understanding at a unique moment, as increasing numbers of people were being displaced and others had the relative privilege of remaining in place, although some of us felt forcibly remained. Kabita's piece is featured in our first issue of Hard, and you can access this. We have flyers with Kabita's artist statement and this wonderful QR code on the back that will take you to the issue and also the virtual installation that goes along with the installation we're going to see shortly outside. All right, with no further ado, I am delighted to introduce our artist, Kabita Das. Kabita is a Boston-based artist, primarily using design, drawing, painting, and photography as her main media. Kabita is a 2020 summa cum laude honors graduate from Boston University's Kilachand Honors College and the College of Fine Arts with a major in graphic design. She has worked as a junior art director at Brand Content in the Boston area. Her work, as you will see, balances form and meaning to create layered concepts and purposeful experiences for viewers. Kabita will offer us an artist talk and then answer some questions before we move outside to experience the installation of Home, Reconstructed.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here on campus. As was mentioned, I used to be a student here and graduated in 2020, so it's really nice to be back here on campus and to see familiar faces, faculty, and to be back in a room where I used to take classes. So it's a bit odd, but it's nice. And so before we dive into things, I did just want to say thank you to a few people as well. Thank you to Professor Preston and Ty Berman for making this event and installation possible in the first place. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to make this happen. Thank you to the KUC faculty for organizing the event, and to the View Carpentry team for installing the installation. It's been an incredible experience working with them as well. It was my first time working with a carpentry team, so I was really excited to work with them, and it went really well. So, and then thank you to the BU Graphic Design Department for a wonderful undergrad experience, and for all the guidance that I had gotten getting this project off the ground and getting my thesis done. And then also thank you, of course, to my family for supporting me throughout, my family and my friends. I could not have done it without all the great support, so I'm also incredibly grateful to all of them. Some of them are here with us today. But yeah, so about 3.5 years ago, I started working on my thesis between junior and senior year. And I think every discipline approaches this idea of thesis a bit differently. But in my case, coming from a graphic design major, we were encouraged to start with a really large idea and over time whittle down that idea to something more specific and focused. And so in my case, I started with this broad idea of space. And that was a topic that, that was a topic that really interested me because I was intrigued by certain situations that I had encountered in which people would occupy shared spaces in very different ways. So for example, riding the T, something we've all done here in Boston, I would always notice two main camps of people. They're the people that have like 2 or 3 bags on them, but managed to occupy exactly 1 seat, no more, no less. And then there's another camp of people that usually don't have any bags on them, but manage to occupy 3 seats at a time. And so I would wonder with situations like that, as simple as they are, what is it exactly that brings these 2 people to the exact same environment and makes them behave so differently? And of course, I think with that, there's a very simple answer, which is that people are different. We have different personalities, different behaviors and tendencies. But I wanted to understand, I think, where those differences really originate from. And so I wasn't just thinking about this in terms of physical spaces, but also conversational spaces and emotional and social, professional spaces. So both physical and non-physical. And so for the first few months of my thesis process, I worked on a handful of creative exercises with the intent of finding a more specific conceptual direction from this broad idea space that I had set up. And so I'm going to briefly walk through 3 of the main projects that I had worked on with that intent. They're all up here. I don't know if you want to pass them around, or if maybe we can pass them around. And so the first exercise was this book of influences, which is the black book that's being passed around. And that was based on an assignment we had gotten during our senior graphic design studio course. And the assignment was to put together a book of sources that we draw inspiration from. And so that could be anything from musicians, other artists, other designers, really anything that we find inspiring. And that we draw influence from. And so for me at the time, I had recently rediscovered this hard drive that I kept between the ages of 13 and 18 roughly. And it was filled with all these pictures that I had taken because I used to be really obsessed with photography. And so I would take pictures of anything I could think of, friends, family, hometown. And so a lot of these pictures being from late middle school, early high school are a little cringe, a little embarrassing. But for the most part, they're very sentimental because to me, they're signs of one of my first real creative obsessions. And they were also a representation of my perception of the world at the time. And so for the purpose of this project, I was interested in revisiting these images and understanding how this creative process that I was kind of unknowingly engaging with at the time from years ago still influences the way that I work now. And so this black book, I designed and I printed and hand-bound and essentially created to be a representation of this connection that I continue to maintain with past creative phases of mine. And this project has no specific conceptual relation to this idea of space that I had set up for my thesis, but I think the process of reflecting on this really intimate and creative material that I had produced myself in the past eventually became a really large part of how I would approach my thesis later on. However, the next project that I worked on was more directly related to this idea of space, and it was in response to Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. And the key idea that I was intrigued by was that in order to reach one's creative potential, it's important to have a space of one's own that allows a person to think and to isolate without disruption. And I started working on this in my senior year, which was the first time I actually had my own bedroom that I didn't share with a roommate. And so for this project, I really took advantage of that, and I gave myself a 2-week period during which I fully utilized my bedroom as a creative space. And I focused on just experimenting and creating as much as possible, knowing that no one would really have to see the work that I was making. And that included anything from drawing to collaging to putting things on the wall and writing and playing with lights and shadows, and all the while documenting the process of doing so. And so this eventually became a lot more about the documentation of the process, more so than the actual creative work. because it was a way for me to reflect on how my process was being influenced by this newfound sense of isolation and privacy. And so I compiled all of this into this book that's being passed around, which I also designed and hand-bound, and it displays a mixture of work that I made and some of the documentation of the process and some notes of my own in the margins. And so the actual layout and design of this is a little bit more chaotic, a little more unstructured to reflect this more experimental process that I was engaging with that also had less structure. And so lastly, all the while, while I was working on these projects, I was also doing a good amount of research, generally circling around the idea of space and reading articles and books and watching videos that approach this idea from a few different perspectives. And so I compiled some of that research into this green book, which is also being passed around. Good thing these are all color-coded. And so that will serve later as a sort of reference for myself as well, just in terms of collecting the things I've looked at and referencing them for functional use. And so these creative exercises were all really done in an attempt to better understand where I thought my pieces should be heading. And I was struggling a bit to find what felt like a meaningful way to narrow things down. And even though I was struggling to do that, I still felt very committed to finding a way to make things personal. And so I was in what felt like a slight standstill with my process for a moment because I wasn't sure exactly how to move forward. But one day, I decided to go home for an afternoon, and my parents lived about 20 minutes from campus, which at the time was a very convenient distance when I needed help with laundry. And that was one of those days. So I went home and I put a load of laundry in the wash, and I hung out with my dad in his office, and he has a pretty large collection of books. So I started looking through his library, really in the hopes of finding anything that remotely related to my thesis that I could read and find direction or inspiration from. And as I browsed, I paused at one of the shelves and I noticed a particularly interesting arrangement of books. But for context first, my mom is from France and my dad is from India, and they both grew up in those countries, and we traveled around when they were young, and then they met each other in Scotland, and then they moved to London where they had my brother, and then they moved to Boston where they had me. And so my family, and my parents specifically, are quite multicultural in that sense. So on the shelf, one next to the other, there was a French to English translation dictionary, English to French dictionary, Bengali to English, English to Bengali, and a handful of Indian cookbooks and French cookbooks. And at the time, this struck me as a beautiful representation of how my parents have negotiated the space between themselves and our home. And I love the idea that this arrangement represents the balance and harmony that they found in making space for and learning about each other's cultures. And how, as an extension of that, all the objects and the belongings in our house represent that too, this sort of negotiation of space. And so, depending on how we grow up and how we experience different versions of what a home can be, we develop different understandings of space as well. And home, by definition, is a space to have some ownership over, where we learn about comfort and belonging and love and boundaries. But no two people have the same experience of home, and over time, we develop unique understandings of what home is to us. And so as we continue to build and rebuild homes throughout our lives, the things that we choose to keep there and to surround ourselves with continuously allows us to assert and to build around who we are and what we value. And so this connects to the way that we behave in all spaces, because it defines what we're comfortable with and what makes the space really suit our needs. So it influences how we occupy space also beyond just our homes, and how much of space we claim for ourselves and how much we'll leave to others. So home and space are not necessarily physical things, but rather they're concepts that we carry and we manifest wherever we go, whether at home or in a classroom or in a conversation with friends. And looking inward and understanding how we define home and space is a really valuable way to understand how our experiences have uniquely shaped us. But it also reveals how and why we participate in shared spaces in a certain way. And there should be a balance between how much we claim for ourselves and how much we root for others. And understanding the roots of our behavior is what ultimately will help us towards making changes in our interactions for our own good and for the good of others. And so that development in my thesis is the conceptual foundation for this installation, which mainly addresses the idea of negotiating shared spaces. And the main interaction of this piece involves the wooden objects that hang from the roof. And so they're all connected in pairs. So a pair of wooden pieces is connected by a single string, which is threaded through 2 holes in the roof of the overhanging structure. And that means that when you pull down on one piece, its connected counterpart gets pulled up, and vice versa. So that interactive element is really intended to encourage a sense of self-awareness in the viewers, and that their very presence and interaction with the space has a direct impact on that environment that they're in. And so I think that this idea is best communicated when multiple people are interacting with the piece at the same time, because it introduces the possibility of disrupting another person's experience when you're interacting with it, because you might pull on a string that's connected to a piece that someone else is holding. And so then that interaction forces some sort of exchange between both participants, where they kind of have to reconcile how they're going to negotiate the space between themselves and how they're going to make space for one another while also preserving their individual experience of the piece. And so the installation was built with 3 levels of interaction in mind. And the first being the act of actually entering the physical space. And so this is a behind-the-scenes construction photo. We'll see the final piece outside. But so the space itself is quite clearly defined in the sense that it has very clear boundaries. There's an inside and there's an outside. But by most other standards, the space is really incomplete in the sense that it has no floors, no walls, no roof or ceiling. And building the installation in this way as this almost incomplete looking framework for a space was a very intentional decision. And it serves as a metaphor of sorts for what our universal definition of what home is. And so if you look up the definition of home on Google, it reads, "a place where one lives permanently, especially as a member of a family or household." And this definition, even though it's universal and it's broad and all-encompassing, is also very incomplete by most other standards, and is by no means representative of most people's experience of what a home is. And so then the second layer of interaction comes when people are looking at the small wooden objects that are hanging from the structure. And these were made intentionally to be small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. They're all roughly like 1.5 inches to 2 inches in width and height. And so that size, because they're so small, it creates, in contrast with this larger space, a much more intimate and personal experience within the piece, where the viewer has to look closely at the writing and manipulate it in order to fully read everything. And so then the space that the viewer is experiencing is shrunken down to the space between their face and their hands. And the objects themselves are hand-carved pieces of wood with pyro-engraved words in them. And I wanted them to be made of the same material as this larger framework, to show that out of this large, big idea and definition of what a home is, people can still carve out their own ideas and define what home is for themselves based on their own unique life experiences. And so then the third layer of this interaction comes with the opportunity for this experience to be disrupted by the presence of others. And the rest of the experience becomes about balancing the individual and intimate experience of the piece for the larger shared one. And so these are really the driving concepts for this installation. And as Professor Preston mentioned, back in 2020, for the graphic design pieces exhibition, my hope was to create some version of this as my final piece. However, we were sent home a few months early because of COVID, as well known, and I wasn't actually able to build this anymore. And so we had moved our typical end-of-year exhibition to a digital space instead, and so all of the design students had to adapt their projects to a digital medium. And with this, I knew right off the bat that because this installation relies so heavily on the physical interaction of it, that I would likely have to create something somewhat new. And so when we were sent home back in 2020, I occupied myself as I was rethinking this project by taking pictures and videos and audio recordings of my house. And I took pictures of all the clutter, food, the decorations, my family, my dog, everything. And I figured that this home was the origin point for my thesis, and that being quarantined there, even though, you know, in this larger context of COVID, which was very real and scary and stressful, it was also an opportunity for me to further deconstruct other small parts of my home in the way that I did with my dad's bookshelf. Because we couldn't leave the house anyway, also. And so this eventually became the basis for the digital portion of this project, which is Reconstructed.com. And this website essentially serves as an archive for all of this documentation. And the site itself is a simple web page with writing of my own laid out along one single web page. And so each word on this page is actually a hyperlink that you can click on and download a zip file onto your laptop. And that zip file will contain a small piece of documentation of my home. And so that could be a video or a JPEG or a piece of writing. And I wanted this site to serve as a sort of framework that people can use to also reflect on their own idea of home and similarly, in their own way, deconstruct and then reconstruct how that has influenced them as well. And so I think there's an element of trust involved in this interaction in the sense that on my end, I'm trusting viewers with this very sensitive and personal content. But then there's also trust that the viewers have to have in me as they're downloading the zip file. They have to trust that they're not downloading some sort of virus onto their laptop. And so this trust serves as almost a protective barrier that I placed on the content, knowing that the act of downloading puts the viewer in an equally vulnerable position that I already feel that I'm in by sharing all of this. And so there's some key overlaps, I think, between the physical installation and the website. And so the website was built using HTML and CSS, which in the world of web development are some of the most basic and simple tools that you can use to construct a site. And this is parallel to the choice of material in the installation, where wood and construction tools are some of the most fundamental tools and materials that can be used to build a space. So because this whole body of work is about deconstructing oneself in order to better understand our own tendencies, I wanted the materials to feel equally bare and stripped down and vulnerable. And so aesthetically, I had the website and installation reflect that too. And as you can see, aesthetically, the site is pretty simple. It almost looks like a Wikipedia page. It has a white background, black text that highlights in blue when you scroll over it. And the installation doesn't have any decorative elements too, so really kept it as simple as possible. But so those are the two main projects that Home Reconstructed encompasses. I have a few more slides here. This is an example of what one of the folders would look like if you downloaded it. You get an image or video, and it has a message kind of embedded in the file naming. And then these are some images that you can download too. This is my house. This is my dog. But yeah, so thank you again, everyone, for being here and for listening and taking questions. expertise now.
So is there meaning to the pairs of, like the pairs that affect one another? Did you choose the words like in a meaningful way, or was it more random?
So the words themselves that are on the wooden objects don't have any specific correlation. They're all kind of generally circling around the idea of home and space, but I think it's more about how they're connected and how that creates this like interpersonal interaction. So that was really the main emphasis. Yeah.
Did you have any of your friends like do test runs to see if they would actually get in each other's way kind of?
Yeah, so actually when I was a student here at BU, one of our earlier assignments was this project called 50 Questions, and that was when I actually did like a prototype of this installation. So it was like, it had the same interaction where like you pull down on one, another gets pulled up, but it was mounted on a wall. So I tested it on my classmates. Yeah.
What was it like trying to get your art installed in a public place? What did that process look like?
Well, I think one thing that we all kind of learned from the process is how long it takes to get things approved. So I definitely learned to be patient with that. But one thing that I had mentioned that was kind of new to me was working with a carpentry team too. So that was definitely something that was very new to me, but very exciting. So just like collaborating with a lot of people from different disciplines, helping the project move along. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
My question is about the decision to make the piece interactive or engaging. I mean, like, what was the inspiration there? The rationale behind it?
I think it really came from a place of wanting to find a way to make people self-aware to a certain extent. Because I was dealing with this idea of space, and I think with the example of riding the T, it's like such a simple and common example, but I think one thing that was running through my mind as I was trying to work through my thesis was just finding a way to make people aware of how they behave in certain shared environments. Not necessarily with an intent of, changing people's behaviors, but I think finding a way for people to just reflect on themselves and how they occupy spaces. Yeah, if that answers your question.
What do you think of the relationship between the digital piece and now the actually realized installation? I'm thinking about whether they really work. Do we need both of them, or do they operate separately as works of art in your mind? Or ideally, do you want to make sure we go out there and then also go to your digital space, or is that less important to you?
I think it's maybe less important to me because when I was thinking through both projects, I was really designing them quite separately. So I think that they hopefully stand on their own conceptually and kind of make sense and don't need each other to explain themselves. But I do like having both because when I was working through my thesis and planning for this installation for the end of year exhibition, I think one thing that I felt was that this installation didn't like incorporate some of like these like personal aspects of home, like when I was looking through my dad's bookshelf and just like noticing very specific elements of my home that stood out to me. And of course this installation still speaks to the idea of home, but the digital piece definitely allowed for the project to be a lot more personal and for me to incorporate some of that specific documentation.
I was also thinking how accessible it is, so for anyone who might be mobility impaired,
Right.
or vulnerable to all the kinds of things that COVID made us aware of, and how you can access this in different ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's another thing. Is like anyone who's not in Boston can interact and understand the project as a whole.
So when you tested it out on your friends, how did you see them like reconciling the balance and the push-pull? Or did you get to see that on the candidate?
Yeah, well, so in the initial prototype, the pieces were a lot closer together. So I think it changed the interaction a little bit. And when people were first interacting, there was an element of like surprise that was followed by conversation. And then that was followed by people just kind of going about looking at the pieces individually. So that was something that I hope translates to this physical installation where there's like an initial moment of people kind of recognizing that they're in the space together and how their presence impact each other, but that people can still maintain a certain individual experience of it too. Oh yeah.
My question about back to the digital version of this project. You definitely opened up like a person thought is like kind of an intimate experience. I know you talked about like the film like that. How is like it's kind of hard to think about artists and authenticity in terms of the things that they create. In terms of like, are they creating something for an audience, or are they sharing parts of themselves that hopefully other people can kind of relate to? So I guess, but then also, the more authentic you are, the more intimate you have to be, and that kind of like has challenges to one's privacy. So I guess like the question I had is like, where do you lie on like the spectrum of authenticity in terms of like creating art, but also like in terms of your own privacy, and then like where do you think like I guess if you have any like argumentative statement about like should things like is it required to sacrifice privacy to create true and authentic art that people can connect to, or is it something that you can balance while still having privacy and creating like pieces of art?
That was definitely something I was thinking about for this project, and that translates a little bit differently for the digital and the physical interaction. For the digital piece, I mean, I think it depends on the artist, but for my work, I would say that incorporating more of like a personal narrative and incorporating more of my personal experiences feels the most authentic to my process. Of course, I think it depends on the artist, but yeah, and I think that's why I mentioned I felt really committed to finding a way to making my pieces personal, because I think that people can really sense when they're looking at a project when people are being genuine and authentic with what they're trying to say. So hopefully that communicates with my project as well. But I felt like that was a really important starting point. But I think for the physical installation, it was a little bit different also because like the digital piece